Hi friends, I'm Bill Venard, and welcome to Equip 412. In this week's episode, we're going to continue our look at more facts surrounding Jesus' resurrection, which we began in our last episode. Let's do a quick review. Fact number 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. Fact number 2, Jesus' disciples believed he rose and appeared to them. They went from unsure, frightened men who basically abandoned him in his hour of need to bold proclaimers of Jesus' resurrection within a very short time after his death, risking their own persecution, torture, and ultimately their martyrdom. And then there was this acronym to help you remember some important facts about this. P-O-W. POW. P is for Paul's testimony about the disciples. Paul wrote about how he received from Jesus' original disciples the explanation of the gospel and how Jesus was raised from the dead. Of course, Paul saw the risen Jesus himself on the road to Damascus in a blinding vision. O is for oral traditions. Many New Testament scholars, including skeptics, believe that Paul received one of the earliest creeds, which he recorded in 1 Corinthians 15, directly from the disciples Peter and James while visiting them in Jerusalem just 3 years after his conversion to Christianity. And W is for written traditions. These came from some of the early church fathers who were actual successors to the original apostles. They wrote what they had been taught by the apostles, and some of those writings have been preserved over the centuries, which bear witness to the validity of what the apostles recorded themselves in the New Testament. Today, in part 2, we're going to learn 3 more facts in support of Jesus' resurrection. The next fact that we'll look at is Paul's radical transformation. Known as Saul, or the Hebrew pronunciation is Shaul, Saul or Shaul of Tarsus was the main persecutor of the church. He was persecutor in chief. But what caused Saul to change and become known as Paul? Luke reports in Acts chapter 9 that while Paul was on his way from Jerusalem to Damascus to persecute the Christians there, he experienced an encounter with the risen Jesus, and he went from being a staunch enemy of the church to becoming largely responsible for spreading the gospel into Asia Minor, Greece, Rome, and surrounding areas. In the process, he went from being persecutor to being persecuted, from persecutor to being preacher for the cause of Christ, and eventually being martyred for his faith at the hands of the Romans. Dr. Gary Habermas writes, "People usually convert to a particular religion because they have heard the message from a secondary source and believe the message. Paul's conversion was based on what he perceived to be a personal experience of the risen Jesus. The risen Jesus appeared directly to him." Fact number 4, James' radical transformation. Although there's not the amount of material available on James that we have on Paul, there is sufficient evidence to know that James also underwent a radical transformation following Jesus' resurrection. Here are just 4 facts about James' transformation. First, the Gospels report that Jesus' brothers, including James, were not believers in Jesus during his ministry, and you can check out those references there. Second, the ancient creed which Paul recorded in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, and that I mentioned earlier, lists a post-resurrection appearance of Jesus to James. Third, following Jesus' resurrection, James is identified as the leader of the Jerusalem church. Again, check out those references. And fourth, James' beliefs in Jesus' resurrection were so sure and so strong that he went on to suffer martyrdom as attested to by 1st century Jewish historian Josephus, 2nd century church historian Hegesippus, and 3rd century Christian philosopher Clement of Alexandria. So, his martyrdom was well known and was confirmed by both Christian and non-Christians alike. Fifth, we have the empty tomb. According to the leading expert on Jesus' resurrection, roughly 75% of scholars on the subject of the resurrection, both Christians and skeptics, accept the empty tomb as a historical fact. And here are some other factors to consider when studying the empty tomb. First, there's the Jerusalem factor. What do I mean? Well, Jesus was executed publicly in Jerusalem. He was buried there, and the empty tomb was first proclaimed in Jerusalem. It would have taken incredible feats of genius and deception to convince the Jewish and Roman authorities that the tomb was empty and Jesus was alive, if in fact that wasn't the case. The claim would have been too easy to check out. All they would have had to do was go to the tomb and exhume the body. A recent attempt to explain why Jesus' Roman and Jewish critics did not do that, did not expose his corpse, goes something like this. By the time the critics would have exposed the body, it would have been sufficiently decomposed to even be recognizable. This theory asserts that if the book of Acts is correct, the disciples did not begin to proclaim the risen Jesus until about 50 days after his crucifixion on the day of Pentecost. Well, that's an assumption made by supporters of this theory, but it's pure speculation. There is no factual basis to that. Did Jesus' disciples remain quiet during that time, even though he had appeared to them on Resurrection Sunday? Even though he ate with them on the shore of the Sea of Galilee a few days after that? It seems like a real stretch of the imagination to think those disciples remained silent about Jesus' resurrection for 50 days. But this theory continues. Suddenly, at the 50-day mark, so it goes, once the disciples began to proclaim Jesus had risen from the dead, then at that time, those 50 days later, the authorities would have wanted to reveal the body, but by then Jesus' corpse would have been so badly decomposed that no one would be able to identify it anyway. Knowing that, the authorities decided not to pursue the idea. That just stretches the imagination too far, friends. The problem with this is threefold. First, even if the body were too badly decomposed, at least a partial identification could have been made by his hair and stature. Also, there would have been evidence of where the nails had been driven through his wrists and feet. Why not just go ahead and exhume the body? Second, even a barely recognizable corpse would have persuaded some people against believing in his resurrection. That could have been enough reason to prevent the movement from ever gaining a foothold in Jerusalem and getting off the ground. Remember, at the 50-day mark, on the day of Pentecost, some 4,000 people believed that Jesus was Messiah and Lord. So, in order to put a stop to that, why not exhume the body? Had the authorities done that, many who had previously believed Jesus' resurrection very possibly would have claimed that this so-called proof was nothing but a hoax. But there probably would have been enough people who, even though they did initially believe Jesus and the resurrection, would cause them to lose confidence in the resurrection specifically and to lose confidence in Christianity in general. But third, where is the evidence that such a theory ever surfaced prior to now? Where's the historical or archaeological evidence of any such theory? If it were true, there would certainly would have been enough critics of the resurrection early on that it would have surfaced at some point before now. Another factor for the empty tomb is enemy attestation. Now, what do I mean by that? If your mother says you are an honest person, we may have a good reason to believe her, yet with some reservation, since she loves you and is probably biased. But if someone who hates you admits that you are an honest person, we have a stronger reason to believe what is being asserted, since potential bias does not exist. The empty tomb is attested by both Christian and non-Christian sources. What would be the point for skeptical non-Christians to claim the tomb was empty if it really wasn't? Why claim the body is missing if it was still in the tomb? Yet the guards assigned to guard the tomb told the chief priests that the tomb was open and the body was missing. And the chief priests told them to lie by saying Jesus' disciples stole it. Look at this. This is from Scripture. Some of the guards went into the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, "Tell people his disciples came by night and stole him away while he was asleep." That's from Matthew 28. So at the same time the women were running to tell the disciples that Jesus had risen, the guards were going to Jesus' enemies to announce all that had taken place regarding the stone being rolled away, the empty tomb, and possibly everything else that they may have witnessed at the tomb. At the very least, this was an indirect admission that the body was unavailable for public display. This is the only opposing theory that we know of that was offered by Jesus' enemies early on. One more factor for the empty tomb is the Jewish view of women. If someone were going to make up a story in an attempt to deceive others, we assume they would not deliberately invent information that could hurt the reliability of the story. For example, we have heard of those who, in attempting to promote themselves, have made up stories about their bravery in the military or having an education they really did not possess. We've probably heard of cases of stolen valor where somebody, got a hold of a uniform and bought some medals and presented themselves as something other than they were. And then we've heard of cases where someone claims to be a medical doctor when the truth is they never even went to medical school. However, is it normal to invent and spread a story about oneself as a thief or a habitual liar? No. No one goes around telling people, "I'm a liar, I'm a thief, I'm a stalker." No normal person goes around making up stories that deliberately makes them look bad. When we come to the account of the empty tomb, women are listed as the primary witnesses. They are not only the first witnesses mentioned, they are also mentioned in all 4 Gospels, whereas male witnesses appear only later and in just 2 Gospels. However, in both Jewish and Roman cultures, women were very lowly esteemed, and their testimony was regarded as questionable, certainly not as credible as a man's. Consider the following Jewish writings. "Sooner let the words of the law be burnt than delivered to women." That's from the Talmud. "The word cannot exist without males and without females. Happy is he whose children are males, and woe to him whose children are females." Again, that's from the Talmud. "Any evidence which a woman gives is not offered is not valid. Also, they are not valid to offer." This is equivalent to saying that one who is a robber is qualified to give the same evidence as a woman. So according to the last statement from the Talmud in the book of Rosh Hashanah, a woman's testimony was given the same regard as that of a robber. Compare the quotes from the Jewish Talmud that we just read to how the disciples initially responded upon first hearing from the women regarding Jesus' resurrection. Luke says they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. The Greek word here used for nonsense means idle talk, nonsense, humbug. Given the low first-century view of women, it seems highly unlikely that the gospel authors would invent such stories which put the testimony of the women front and center. They were primary witnesses. That was unheard of. If the gospel writers had invented the story of the empty tomb, it's far more likely that they would have described men making the discovery instead of women. In order to avoid the issue of females altogether, why wouldn't they just say something like the disciples of Joseph of Arimathea or Nicodemus discovered the empty tomb? That would certainly have made sense since it was Joseph's family tomb anyway. If the account of the empty tomb had been invented, it would have been far more likely that they would not have listed the women as the primary witnesses. They not only discovered the empty tomb, but the risen Jesus appeared to them first. And the disciples who were clustered back in their hideout didn't believe them at first. But then they learned that it was in fact true. Something else important to remember is that the empty tomb does not stand alone. Doctors Habermas and Licona write, "It should be noted that the empty tomb by itself proves little. If there were no credible accounts of appearances, it could be explained away by suggesting that someone stole the body. However, the empty tomb does not stand alone. It is consistent with the beliefs of the disciples Paul and James that Jesus arose from the dead and belongs in a collection of historical data on the subject. In other words, the resurrection and, combined with, post-resurrection appearances of Jesus are just as much historical facts as Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. History is history, whether we like it or not. Here's something to help you remember these key facts, supporting the evidence for the empty tomb. Remember the acronym JET. J is for the Jerusalem factor. E is for enemy attested, and T is for the testimony of women. This episode and the previous ones go together, so make sure you watch them both. Let's summarize what we've learned. In the last episode, we learned that Jesus died by crucifixion, and Jesus' disciples believed he rose and appeared to them. In this current episode, we learn Paul's radical transformation, James' radical transformation, and the empty tomb, and along with the acronym JET. I just want to reiterate this important truth one more time. If the tomb was empty because Jesus rose from the dead, then God exists, miracles are real, and eternal life is both possible and available. I strongly encourage you to purchase a copy of The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus by Drs. Gary Habermas and Michael Licona. And there are many other excellent books and resources about Jesus' resurrection. Personally, I think this one is the best, but find some other resources and study up on this topic itself. It's key. It's the key to Christianity. If it's not true, then Christianity is not true. I want to thank you for watching this episode of Equip 412 on Jesus' resurrection. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to contact me at equip412.com. I just ask that you keep your comments courteous and respectful. Also, please like, follow, share, and subscribe to equip412.com. Until next time, remember the words of the Apostle Peter in 1 Peter 3:15. In your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. May the Lord bless you, friends, and I pray you will join me next time.